The dust billowed across the auction platform as Harriet Vance clutched her younger sister's trembling hand with all the strength she could muster. At 22, Harriet had never imagined such a fate standing before a crowd of strangers in Fort Stockton, Texas, in the scorching summer of 1875, being sold to the highest bidder alongside 18-year-old Clara. Next up, two sisters from back east, young, strong, and hardworking. Educated too, if that matters to any of you gentlemen, the auctioneer called out, his voice carrying across the town square. Bidding starts at $50 for the pair. Harriet's eyes burned with unshed tears as she stared straight ahead, refusing to meet the gazes of the men evaluating them like cattle. The circumstances that had brought them to this moment still felt like a terrible nightmare. Their parents' sudden death from fever, the discovery of overwhelming debts, the unscrupulous banker who had seized their family home in Virginia, and then sold them to a labor contractor heading west. All of it had happened in a whirlwind of grief and confusion. "I won't let go," Harriet whispered to Clara, whose slender fingers were intertwined with hers. "No matter what happens." Clara's face was pale beneath her bonnet, freckles standing out starkly against her fair skin. "They can't separate us, can they, Harriet? They wouldn't." But Harriet knew better. In this harsh new territory, there were few protections for women like them, penniless, alone, and desperate. The labor contractor had made it clear. They were to be sold to recoup his transportation costs, and if separate buyers wanted them, so be it. $60. Called a portly man near the front, his eyes lingering uncomfortably on Clara. $70, shouted another. "I'll take the older one for $80. A third voice joined in, and Harriet's stomach lurched at the implication. The auctioneer looked pleased as the bidding continued. "We have $80 for just the older sister. Do I hear more for the pair?" "$95 for both," called a thin-faced man with yellowed teeth. Harriet squeezed Clara's hand tighter, feeling her sister's silent sob through the connection between their palms. $100. The new voice was deep and clear, cutting through the murmuring crowd. Heads turned to see a tall figure at the back of the gathering. Harriet squinted against the sun to make him out broad-shouldered, wearing a worn leather vest over a faded blue shirt, a weathered Stetson pulled low over his eyes. $110, countered the portly man. The stranger stepped forward, his spurs jingling softly as he moved through the crowd. $200, he said firmly, for both ladies, together. A hush fell over the gathered townsfolk. $200 was no small sum in Fort Stockton. The auctioneer's eyes gleamed. $200, going once, going twice, $225. The thin-faced man interrupted desperately. The cowboy didn't hesitate. $300, and that's final. There was steel in his voice that suggested he wasn't a man to be trifled with. "I'll take you both and keep you together," he added, addressing Harriet and Clara directly for the first time. The crowd murmured. No one else raised the bid. "Sold," the auctioneer declared, bringing down his gavel with finality. "To Mr. Mason Fairchild for $300. Harriet's legs nearly buckled with relief that they wouldn't be separated, though fear quickly replaced it. What did this stranger want with two young women? What would become of them now? The man Mason Fairchild approached the platform and handed a leather pouch to the auctioneer. Then he turned to the sisters, and Harriet got her first clear look at his face. He was younger than she'd expected, perhaps 30, with a strong jaw shadowed by stubble, sun-weathered skin, and the most startling blue eyes she'd ever seen. There were lines at their corners that suggested he smiled often, though he wasn't smiling now. "Ladies," he said, his voice softer than when he'd been bidding, "if you'll come with me, I've got a wagon waiting." Harriet drew herself up, still holding Clara's hand. "Sir, I must ask, what are your intentions? What work will you have us do?" Something like surprise flashed across his face, followed by what might have been respect. "Nothing unseemly, miss. I need help running my ranch, cooking, cleaning, and such. It's a proper job with a proper wage, once you've worked off what I paid today." He offered a hand to help them down from the platform. After a moment's hesitation, Harriet accepted it, noting the calluses on his palm and the gentleness with which he assisted first her, then Clara. "My name is Mason Fairchild," he said as he led them toward a wagon at the edge of the square. "I have a cattle ranch about 10 miles outside of town. It's not much to look at, but it's growing. You'll have your own room in the main house. It's safe there." "I'm Harriet Vance," she replied, her voice steadier than she felt. "This is my sister, Clara. We're grateful you kept us together." Mason glanced back at her, those blue eyes appraising. "Family should stay together, Miss Vance. That's something I believe in strongly." As he helped them into the wagon, Harriet caught sight of a small wooden cross hanging from a leather cord around his neck. A man of faith, perhaps. She allowed herself to hope, just a little, that maybe they had found not just a master but a protector. The ride to Mason Fairchild's ranch was mostly silent. Clara, exhausted from the ordeal, leaned against Harriet's shoulder while Mason handled the reins with practiced ease. The landscape of West Texas stretched out around them, vast expanses of dry grassland dotted with mesquite, prickly pear, and the occasional cottonwood tree. So different from the lush greenery of Virginia they'd left behind. "How did you come to be at that auction?" Mason finally asked, breaking the silence. Harriet hesitated, but there seemed little point in hiding their circumstances. "Our parents died of fever 3 months ago. We discovered afterward that father had debts we knew nothing about. The bank took our home, and a man named Wilcox bought our labor contracts to bring us west. He said there was demand for educated women to be governesses or shopkeepers' assistants." Mason's jaw tightened. "Wilcox lied. He's known for bringing Eastern women out here under false pretenses." "We realized that too late," Harriet said quietly. "By then, we were already in Texas with no money and no way back home." Clara stirred beside her. "Will we truly be safe at your ranch, Mr. Fairchild?" He nodded, his expression solemn. "You have my word on that, Miss Clara. No one will harm you while you're under my protection." As the wagon crested a small rise, Mason's ranch came into view. It was modest compared to the great Virginia estates Harriet had known, but substantial by frontier standards, a sturdy 2-story house built of stone and timber, a large barn, corrals for cattle and horses, and several smaller outbuildings. A creek meandered nearby, lined with cottonwoods that provided welcome shade. "It's not much," Mason said, echoing his earlier comment, "but it's home." As they drew closer, Harriet noticed a figure emerge from the barn, a wiry older man with a weathered face and silver hair. "That's Hank," Mason explained. "He's been with me since I started this place 6 years ago. There's also Miguel who helps with the cattle, but he's out with the herd today." The wagon rolled to a stop before the house, and Hank approached, eyeing Harriet and Clara curiously. "These are the Vance sisters," Mason told him. "Miss Harriet and Miss Clara. They'll be helping around the house." Hank tipped his hat politely. "Ladies, good to have you. Been telling the boss for years he needs some civilizing influence around here." Mason shot him a look that Harriet couldn't quite interpret. "Hank, could you see to the horses? I'll show the ladies inside." The house was simple but well built, with a large kitchen and dining area downstairs, along with Mason's study. Upstairs were 4 bedrooms, Mason's at one end of the hall, Hank's at the other when he wasn't sleeping in the bunkhouse, and 2 vacant rooms in between that would now belong to Harriet and Clara. "You can rest today," Mason said as he showed them the adjoining bedrooms. "There are some clothes in the trunks that might fit you. They belong to my sister-in-law before she and my brother moved to California. Tomorrow we can discuss your duties." Harriet couldn't hold back her question any longer. "Mr. Fairchild, why did you do it? Why spend so much money on strangers?" Mason paused in the doorway, his expression unreadable. "I recognized the look in your eyes, Miss Vance. The same one my mother had when she and my brother and I were sold after my father died. We were separated. I never saw her again." He touched the small wooden cross at his neck. "I couldn't let that happen to you and your sister." With that, he left them to settle in, his footsteps echoing down the wooden staircase. Clara sat heavily on one of the beds. "Do you think we can trust him, Harriet?" Harriet looked out the window at the vast Texas landscape, feeling both lost and unexpectedly found. "I think so, Clara. For now, at least, we have shelter, protection, and each other. That's more than we had this morning." She unpinned her hair, letting the dark waves fall around her shoulders, and for the first time in months, allowed herself to breathe. The following days established a routine at the Fairchild Ranch. Harriet took charge of the kitchen, preparing meals for Mason, Hank, and Miguel when he wasn't out with the herd. Clara, who had always loved sewing, began mending clothes and linens that had clearly needed a woman's touch for some time. Mason was often gone from sunrise until evening, working with the cattle or riding the boundaries of his property. When he was home, he was unfailingly polite but maintained a certain distance, as if wary of frightening them with too much familiarity. At the end of their first week, Mason invited Harriet to join him in his study after dinner. "I want to be clear about our arrangement," he said, sitting behind a simple oak desk. "The $300 I paid will be considered an advance on your wages. I typically pay ranch hands $30 a month plus room and board. At that rate, you and your sister would work 5 months to cover it. Does that seem fair?" Harriet was taken aback. She had expected to be treated as an indentured servant for years, not months. "That's more than fair, Mr. Fairchild. Mason, please. We don't stand on formality much out here." He leaned back in his chair. "And after those 5 months, if you wish to stay on, you'll receive regular wages. If you choose to leave, I'll help you get established elsewhere." "That's very generous," he shrugged. "It's honest is all. You should have choices in your life, Miss Vance." "Harriet," she corrected, offering a small smile. "If we're not standing on formality." Something in his eyes softened. "Harriet, then." The next morning, Harriet woke early to prepare breakfast. She was surprised to find Mason already in the kitchen, coffee brewing on the stove. "I'm usually up before everyone," he explained. "Old habit from Army days." Harriet tied an apron over her borrowed dress. "You were in the Army, Union Cavalry. Joined up in '63, just turned 18. Stayed on after the war to serve at Fort Concho until '69. He poured her a cup of coffee. "That's how I came to know this part of Texas." As Harriet began preparing biscuit dough, she felt his eyes on her. "You don't have to do all this yourself," he said. "I managed before, you know." "I don't mind," she replied. "It feels good to be useful again. After our parents died, Clara and I had no purpose. Everything was taken from us so quickly." Mason nodded, understanding in his gaze. "Loss changes you, makes you see what truly matters." Before she could respond, Hank entered the kitchen, breaking the moment between them. But throughout the day, Harriet found herself thinking about Mason's words and the quiet strength behind them. The weeks passed, and summer heat gave way to the cooler days of early autumn. Harriet and Clara settled into life at the ranch, their initial wariness gradually replaced by a growing comfort. The borrowed clothes were supplemented by new fabric Mason brought from town, which Clara skillfully transformed into dresses more suited to their new lives. One evening, as Harriet was preparing supper, she heard hoofbeats approaching at speed. Looking out the window, she saw Mason riding hard toward the house, followed by Miguel. Alarmed, she hurried onto the porch. Mason dismounted in a fluid motion, his expression grim. "Cattle rustlers hit the north pasture," he explained quickly. "They took about 20 head. Miguel and I are going after them. Hank will stay here to keep watch." Harriet's heart raced with sudden fear. "Is that safe? Shouldn't you alert the sheriff?" "Sheriff Taylor's 2 days' ride away in El Paso." Mason checked his revolver. "By then, those cattle will be across the border or rebranded." "But what if they are dangerous men?" Mason's eyes met hers, and she was struck by the determination in them. "Most are just desperate." "But I can't let them take what I've worked for." He hesitated, then added more softly, "Don't worry, I've handled worse." As he remounted his horse, Harriet found herself saying, "Be careful, Mason." He touched the brim of his hat in acknowledgement. "Always am, Harriet." She watched until he and Miguel disappeared into the gathering dusk, a knot of worry tight in her chest. Clara joined her on the porch. "Will they be all right?" "I hope so," Harriet whispered. "I truly hope so." That night was the longest of Harriet's life. She and Clara sat up late with Hank, who tried to reassure them with tales of Mason's capabilities. "He tracked a mountain lion that was killing calves last spring," Hank told them. "Followed it for 3 days before he got it. Man's got instincts like an Apache scout." Despite Hank's confidence, Harriet couldn't sleep. Near dawn, she was sitting on the porch when she heard horses approaching. She stood, straining to see in the pre-dawn light, and relief washed over her when she recognized Mason's tall figure leading the way. She hurried to meet him as he dismounted, noting the exhaustion in his face and the dried blood on his sleeve. "You're hurt." "Just a graze," he dismissed, though he winced when she touched his arm. "We got the cattle back. The rustlers won't be bothering us again." Harriet insisted on tending to his wound. A bullet had indeed grazed his upper arm. As she cleaned and bandaged it in the kitchen, their faces close in the lamplight, she found herself acutely aware of his presence, the scent of leather and dust that clung to him, the steady rhythm of his breathing. "Thank you," he said quietly when she finished. "It's the least I can do." Harriet's hands lingered on the bandage. "I was worried." Mason's eyes found hers. "Were you?" Something shifted between them in that moment, a recognition, perhaps, of feelings neither had acknowledged. But before Harriet could respond, Clara appeared in the doorway, breaking the spell. "You're back. Are you all right?" Mason stood, putting a respectful distance between himself and Harriet. "Right as rain, Miss Clara. Nothing to fret about." Later that day, after Mason had slept, Harriet found him sitting on the porch, staring out at the land that stretched toward the distant mountains. "May I join you?" she asked. He nodded, making room on the bench. They sat in companionable silence for a while before Mason spoke. "I've been thinking. You and Clara have been here nearly 2 months now. How are you finding it?" "Better than I ever expected," Harriet admitted. "When we first arrived in Fort Stockton, I was certain we'd found ourselves in hell. But now—" She glanced at him. "Now I'm starting to think of this place as home." A smile tugged at the corner of Mason's mouth. "I'm glad to hear that. It's a hard land, but a good one once you get to know it." "Like its people, perhaps," Harriet suggested. Mason's eyes met hers, and that same awareness passed between them. "Perhaps." The moment was interrupted by the distant sound of an approaching wagon. Mason stood, shading his eyes to see. "We're not expecting visitors." As the wagon drew closer, Harriet recognized the thin-faced man who had bid against Mason at the auction. Her body tensed instinctively. "That's Walter Simmons," Mason said, his voice hardening. "Owns the saloon in town. What business he has here I can't imagine." The wagon stopped before the house and Simmons climbed down, adjusting his fancy vest. "Fairchild," he called out in greeting, though his smile didn't reach his eyes. "Been meaning to pay you a visit." Mason stepped forward, placing himself subtly between Simmons and Harriet. "What brings you out this way, Walter?" Simmons' gaze slid to Harriet, lingering in a way that made her skin crawl. "Heard you had some new help around the place. Thought I'd make an offer." "I'm still looking for a girl to serve drinks at my establishment. Pays good, especially with the extra opportunities." Harriet felt ill at his implication. Mason's voice was dangerously quiet. "Miss Vance and her sister are employed here. They're not available. Come now, Fairchild." "A working ranch is no place for ladies like them. My offer stands at $300 for the older one. You'd get your money back, and she'd be better suited to town life." Mason took a step toward Simmons, his hand hovering near his holstered revolver. "The ladies aren't for sale, Walter." "Not now, not ever. I suggest you get back in your wagon and leave my property." Simmons' face darkened. "No need to be hostile, just a friendly business proposition." "There's nothing friendly about treating people like property," Mason replied. "Good day, Simmons." The saloon owner hesitated, then climbed back into his wagon. "You'll regret crossing me, Fairchild," he called as he turned the wagon around. "Mark my words." As the wagon receded, Harriet released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "Thank you," she said softly. Mason's expression was troubled. "I'm sorry you had to hear that. Simmons is the worst kind of opportunist, but you should know men like him are common out here. It's why I've tried to keep you and Clara at the ranch as much as possible." Harriet straightened her shoulders. "We're not naive, Mason. We understand the dangers, but we can't live in fear forever." He studied her face. "No, I suppose you can't." After a moment, he added, "The fall festival is happening in town next week. Perhaps you and Clara would like to attend. It would be a chance to meet some of the decent folks of Fort Stockton." Harriet smiled, touched by his concern and his offer. "We'd like that very much." The fall festival transformed Fort Stockton from a dusty frontier town into a place of celebration. Bunting and lanterns decorated the main street. Tables groaned with food brought by local families, and a small band of musicians played lively tunes that had couples dancing in the cleared area before the courthouse. Harriet and Clara had spent days preparing for the event, altering their best dresses and helping Mason and the ranch hands look presentable. Now, as their wagon approached town, Harriet felt both excitement and trepidation. This would be their first real introduction to the community. Mason helped them down from the wagon, looking uncharacteristically formal in a clean shirt and vest, his usually unruly hair slicked back. "Ladies, welcome to the Fort Stockton Fall Festival. It's not Virginia high society, but we managed to enjoy ourselves." Several people greeted Mason warmly as he escorted Harriet and Clara through the gathering. He introduced them as Miss Harriet and Miss Clara Vance, who have been helping at my ranch. No mention was made of how they had come to be there, and Harriet was grateful for his discretion. While Clara was swept into a circle of young women admiring each other's dresses, Mason led Harriet toward the refreshment table. "Are you enjoying yourself?" he asked. "It's wonderful," she admitted. "I didn't realize how much I missed being around people. Other women, especially." Mason smiled, a genuine smile that transformed his face. "You could come to town more often. Now that people have met you properly, you'd be welcome." Before Harriet could respond, a woman's voice called out, "Mason Fairchild, is that you looking so civilized?" They turned to see a handsome older woman approaching, her silver-streaked dark hair arranged elegantly beneath a small hat. "Mrs. Sullivan," Mason greeted her, bending to kiss her cheek. "You're looking well. And you've been keeping secrets, Mrs." Sullivan replied, her sharp eyes taking in Harriet. "Aren't you going to introduce me to your lovely companion, Mrs. Eleanor Sullivan? May I present Miss Harriet Vance?" "Harriet, Mrs. Sullivan is our town's finest dressmaker and the widow of Fort Stockton's first mayor." "A pleasure, my dear," Mrs. Sullivan said, clasping Harriet's hand. "Mason has never brought a young lady to the festival before. You must be special indeed." Harriet felt heat rise to her cheeks. "I'm merely employed at Mr. Fairchild's ranch along with my sister." Mrs. Sullivan's knowing smile suggested she didn't entirely believe this explanation. "Well, regardless, it's about time Mason had some feminine company. This one works too hard, never takes time for pleasure." "Now, Mrs. Sullivan," Mason protested, though Harriet noticed his ears had reddened. The band struck up a lively tune and couples began forming for a dance. "Oh, perfect timing," Mrs. Sullivan declared. "Mason, do show Miss Vance that those dancing lessons your mother insisted on weren't completely wasted." Before either could object, Mrs. Sullivan had practically pushed them toward the dancing area. Mason looked at Harriet with a mixture of embarrassment and amusement. "Mrs. Sullivan is something of a force of nature," he explained. "We don't have to dance if you'd rather not." Harriet surprised herself with her answer. "I'd like to. It's been so long since I danced." Mason's eyes lit up. "In that case, Miss Vance, may I have the honor?" He extended his hand, and Harriet took it, allowing him to lead her into the set that was forming. The dance was a simple reel, but as they moved through the steps, hands meeting and parting, circling each other in the pattern of the dance, Harriet felt a joy she hadn't experienced since before her parents' deaths. Mason was a better dancer than she had expected, moving with the same quiet confidence he showed on horseback. When their hands met, she felt the calluses that spoke of his hard work, but his touch was invariably gentle. "You're full of surprises, Mr. Fairchild," she said as they came together in the dance. His smile reached his eyes. "As are you, Miss Vance." The music ended too soon for Harriet's liking. As Mason escorted her from the dancing area, she noticed Clara watching them, a knowing smile on her face that Harriet chose to ignore. The evening continued pleasantly, with more dancing, delicious food, and conversation with the townsfolk, who seemed genuinely welcoming. Harriet was introducing Clara to Mrs. Sullivan when she happened to glance across the square and freeze. Walter Simmons stood watching them from the doorway of his saloon, his expression cold and calculating. Beside him was the labor contractor Wilcox, who had brought the sisters to Fort Stockton in the first place. Clara followed her gaze and gripped Harriet's arm tightly. "Is that?" "Yes," Harriet confirmed quietly. "Don't look at them." But it was too late. Simmons had seen their recognition and was now crossing the square toward them, Wilcox in tow. Mason, who had been speaking with the blacksmith nearby, immediately moved to intercept the men. "Simmons." "Wilcox." His greeting was curt. "Quite a party," Simmons remarked, his gaze sliding past Mason to where Harriet and Clara stood. "Wouldn't have expected to see these ladies here, considering their background." Several nearby conversations quieted as people turned to observe the confrontation. "The Vance sisters are respected employees at my ranch," Mason said evenly. "Their background is no one's concern but their own." Wilcox stepped forward, his voice carrying. "Seems to me the good people of Fort Stockton might be interested to know they're consorting with women who were sold at auction not 3 months ago." A murmur ran through the crowd. Harriet felt shame wash over her, though she knew they had done nothing wrong. Clara's hand trembled in hers. "That's enough, Wilcox," Mason warned, but Simmons pressed on. "What's the matter, Fairchild? Afraid people will realize what kind of women you've brought into their midst, or are you keeping them for yourself?" Mason's hand moved to his revolver. "I won't warn you again, Mrs. Sullivan suddenly stepped forward, positioning herself between Mason and the two troublemakers. "Mr. Simmons, Mr. Wilcox, you are disrupting a community gathering. If you have nothing pleasant to contribute, I suggest you return to your establishment." Her voice was steel wrapped in silk. Simmons scowled but seemed unwilling to challenge the respected widow. "This isn't over, Fairchild," he muttered before backing away. As the men retreated, Harriet felt all eyes on her and Clara. The festive mood was shattered, replaced by curious and judgmental stares. "Perhaps we should go," she said quietly to Mason. He nodded, his expression grim. "I'm sorry, Harriet, I should have anticipated this." As they prepared to leave, Mrs. Sullivan approached them. "Don't let those ruffians drive you away, my dear. Their type always causes trouble." Harriet smiled weakly. "Thank you for your kindness, Mrs. Sullivan, but I think it's best if we return to the ranch." The older woman patted her hand. "You come see me in my shop soon. I could use an assistant with your refined taste." The ride back to the ranch was silent, the evening's joy overshadowed by the public humiliation. Once home, Clara excused herself immediately, but Harriet lingered on the porch, unable to face the confines of her room. Mason joined her after settling the horses. "I'm truly sorry about tonight," he said, sitting beside her on the bench. "It's not your fault," Harriet replied. "Our circumstances were bound to become known eventually. Still, you didn't deserve to be exposed that way." He hesitated. "If you and Clara wish to leave Fort Stockton, I would understand. I could arrange passage to San Antonio, perhaps. It's a larger city where no one would know your history." The thought of leaving sent an unexpected pang through Harriet's heart. "Is that what you want? For us to go?" "No," Mason answered, his voice low and certain. "That's not what I want at all." Their eyes met in the soft light from the lantern hanging by the door, and Harriet saw something in his gaze that made her breath catch a warmth, a longing that mirrored her own awakening feelings. "Then we'll stay," she said simply. "We've faced worse than gossip, Mason. This is our home now." His hand found hers on the bench between them, his calloused fingers gently enveloping her smaller ones. They sat like that for a long time, watching the stars emerge above the Texas landscape, neither needing words to express what was growing between them. The following weeks brought changes to the Fairchild Ranch. True to her word, Mrs. Sullivan hired Clara to help in her dressmaking shop 3 days a week. Despite the initial gossip following the festival incident, the townspeople largely accepted the Vance sisters, particularly as Mrs. Sullivan's approval carried significant weight in the community. Harriet remained primarily at the ranch, but her role evolved from servant to something closer to partner. Mason began consulting her on decisions, valuing her education and different perspective. Together, they pored over account books in the evenings, finding ways to make the ranch more profitable. On a crisp November afternoon, Mason suggested they ride to check on a new well being dug on the eastern boundary of his property. It was the first time they'd ridden out together alone, and Harriet found herself both nervous and excited at the prospect. Mason provided her with a gentle mare and waited patiently while she adjusted to being in the saddle. "You ride well for someone raised back east," he commented as they set out. "My father kept horses," Harriet explained. "I wasn't allowed to ride astride, of course always side saddle like a proper lady, but I loved it all the same." Mason chuckled. "Not much call for side saddles out here. Function over form is the rule of the frontier." As they rode, he pointed out features of his land places where the grass grew best for grazing. A hidden spring that never dried up even in the worst droughts, the ruins of an old Spanish mission barely visible on a distant hillside. "You love this land," Harriet observed. Mason nodded. When I first saw it after leaving the army, something just felt right, like I'd found where I belonged. He glanced at her. Do you miss Virginia? Harriet considered the question. I miss what it was, my childhood home, my parents alive, the security of it all. But that place doesn't exist anymore, and I'm finding there's much to appreciate here. Such as, Mason prompted, a hint of teasing in his voice. She smiled. The vastness of the sky. The way the land changes color with the light. The freedom to be something other than what society dictated I should be. They reached the well site where Miguel was working with another ranch hand. After checking the progress and discussing plans for a small shelter to protect the well, Mason suggested they take a different route back to see more of the property. Their path led them to a ridge overlooking a valley, where a stream cut through the landscape. Cottonwood trees grew along its banks, their leaves golden in the autumn sun. Mason dismounted and helped Harriet down from her horse. This is my favorite spot on the entire ranch, he admitted, leading her to a large flat rock overlooking the valley. I come here to think sometimes. They sat side by side, taking in the view. The late afternoon light bathed everything in a warm glow, turning the ordinary landscape into something magical. It's beautiful, Harriet said softly. Mason turned to look at her, his blue eyes serious. Harriet, there's something I need to say. Her heart quickened. Yes, these past months with you and Clara here have changed things, changed me. He chose his words carefully. I know our arrangement began under unusual circumstances, but I hope you know that I now consider you both family, not employees. We feel the same, Harriet assured him. Mason took a deep breath. The thing is, my feelings for you have become more complicated than that. Harriet felt a blush warm her cheeks. Complicated? I find myself thinking about you all the time, he confessed. Your smile, your cleverness, the way you've brought life back to my home. I never expected to feel this way about anyone. He reached for her hand, his touch sending warmth through her despite the cooling evening air. I'm not a wealthy man, Harriet. I can't offer you the life you might have had in Virginia, but everything I have, everything I am, I would share with you, if you wanted that. Harriet's heart felt too full for her chest. Are you asking what I think you're asking, Mason Fairchild? A smile touched his lips. I suppose I am, though not very eloquently. Harriet Vance, would you consider becoming my wife? The question hung in the air between them, momentous and life-changing. Harriet thought of the journey that had brought her here, the loss, the fear, the auction block where this man had first entered her life. It seemed impossible that such darkness could lead to this moment of light. Yes, she whispered, then more confidently. Yes, I would be honored to be your wife. Mason's face transformed with joy. He reached out tentatively, his hand cupping her cheek with infinite gentleness. When she leaned into his touch, he bent forward slowly, giving her every chance to pull away before his lips met hers in a first, tender kiss. It was brief and sweet, full of promise rather than passion, but it sealed something between them that Harriet knew would last a lifetime. As they rode back to the ranch, side by side in the gathering dusk, Harriet felt a sense of peace she hadn't known since before her parents' deaths. Whatever challenges lay ahead, she would face them with Mason beside her. Clara was overjoyed at the news of their engagement. I knew it, she exclaimed, hugging Harriet fiercely. I've seen how he looks at you when you aren't watching. And how is that? Harriet asked, laughing. Like you're the sunrise after the longest night, Clara said with unexpected poetry. I'm so happy for you both. Mason suggested a Christmas wedding, giving them just over a month to prepare. Unless you want something more elaborate, he asked Harriet. She shook her head. Simple and soon sounds perfect to me. The news spread quickly through Fort Stockton. Most reactions were positive, with Mrs. Sullivan immediately offering to help create a wedding dress. But Mason warned that not everyone would approve. "Simmons has been spreading ugly rumors since the festival," he told Harriet, "saying I bought you for immoral purposes and now I'm trying to make it respectable." Harriet lifted her chin defiantly. "Let him talk. We know the truth." Despite their determination to ignore the gossip, tensions in town were rising. Mason returned from a supply run one day with a cut on his face and bruised knuckles. He tried to dismiss it, but Hank later told Harriet that Simmons' men had confronted Mason in town. "They said some things about you that no decent man could let pass," Hank explained. "Boss handled it, though, 3 against 1, and he still walked away on his own 2 feet. Harriet confronted Mason that evening. "You can't fight the entire town for my honor." "Not the entire town," he corrected. "Just the troublemakers. And yes, I can and will defend your honor when necessary." His expression softened. "But you're right that we need a better solution." The opportunity came unexpectedly a week later when Sheriff Taylor returned to Fort Stockton. He paid a visit to the ranch after hearing about the confrontations in town. "Mason Fairchild," the sheriff greeted him. "Heard you've been stirring up trouble while I was away." Mason shook the lawman's hand. "Not by choice, Taylor." The sheriff's weathered face creased in a smile when Mason introduced Harriet as his fiancée. "Pleased to meet you, Miss Vance. You must be special to have caught this one's eye. Been trying to match him with my niece for years without success." Over coffee, Mason explained the situation with Simmons and Wilcox. Sheriff Taylor listened thoughtfully. "Labor contracts like the one Wilcox claims he had are questionable at best," the sheriff said. "And auctioning women on the town square should never have happened. That's not how we do things in a civilized town." "It happened while Deputy Brooks was in charge," Mason pointed out. "I don't think he knew how to stop it." Sheriff Taylor frowned. "Brooks is young, should have sent for me." He turned to Harriet. "Miss Vance, I'd like to hear your side of this story if you're willing." Harriet recounted everything: her parents' deaths, the debts, Wilcox's false promises, and the auction where Mason had bought her and Clara's contracts. When she finished, the sheriff nodded decisively. "I'll handle Wilcox. Man's been skirting the law too long. As for Simmons, he owns that saloon, but he doesn't own this town. I'll make that clear to him." True to his word, Sheriff Taylor confronted both men the following day. While the details weren't made public, the results were evident. Wilcox left Fort Stockton on the next stagecoach east, and Simmons' harassment abruptly ceased. "What did you say to them?" Mason asked when the sheriff stopped by to report his success. Sheriff Taylor's eyes twinkled. "Let's just say I reminded them of certain laws regarding fraudulent contracts and intimidation, and I may have mentioned that the Texas Rangers take a dim view of men who traffic in women." With the shadow of Simmons and Wilcox lifted, preparations for the wedding proceeded smoothly. Mrs. Sullivan and Clara created a beautiful gown for Harriet from ivory silk that Mason ordered specially from San Antonio. The ranch hands built extra tables and benches for the celebration, and news spread that the Fairchild wedding would be the social event of the season. The day before Christmas Eve dawned clear and unusually mild for December. The ceremony would take place at the small church in Fort Stockton, followed by a celebration at the ranch for anyone who wished to attend. On her wedding morning, Harriet woke with the sun, too excited to sleep. Clara helped her dress and arranged her dark hair with sprigs of winter berries and greenery. "You look beautiful," Clara said, tears in her eyes. "Mother and Father would be so proud of you." Harriet hugged her sister tightly. "Of both of us, Clara, we survived." "More than survived," Clara corrected. "We found a home, a family." Hank drove them to town in the wagon decorated with evergreen boughs. The church was filled beyond capacity, with people standing along the walls and children sitting cross-legged in the aisles. It seemed the entire population of Fort Stockton had turned out for the occasion. As Harriet walked down the aisle on Hank's arm, the old ranch hand having proudly accepted when she asked him to give her away, she saw only Mason waiting for her at the altar. He looked handsome in a new black suit, his hair neatly trimmed, his blue eyes bright with emotion. The ceremony was simple but deeply meaningful. They exchanged vows written in their own words, promises of love, respect, and partnership that reflected their unique journey together. "I take you, Harriet Vance, as my wife," Mason said, his voice steady despite the emotion visible in his eyes. "I promise to protect and cherish you, to be your shelter in storms both literal and figurative, to build a life worthy of the trust you've placed in me, and to love you faithfully until my last breath." When it was her turn, Harriet spoke clearly, wanting everyone to hear her choice. "I take you, Mason Fairchild, as my husband. I promise to stand beside you through hardship and joy, to build our home with love and care, to face each day with courage and honesty, and to love you with all my heart for all the days we are granted together." The celebration afterward was unlike anything Fort Stockton had seen before. Tables groaned with food contributed by townsfolk. A small band played lively music, and Mason and Harriet were surrounded by well-wishers. Even those who had initially gossiped about their unusual beginning now offered congratulations. As evening fell, lanterns illuminated the ranch yard where couples danced under the stars. Mason led Harriet in a waltz, holding her closer than propriety might typically allow. "Happy, Mrs. Fairchild," he murmured against her hair. The name sent a thrill through her. "Happier than I ever thought possible," she answered truthfully. Later, when most guests had departed and Clara had retired to her room, which would remain hers whenever she wasn't staying in town for work, Mason led Harriet to the master bedroom that would now be theirs. He had prepared it carefully, with fresh linens on the bed and a small bouquet of winter flowers on the dresser. A fire burned in the small fireplace, casting a warm glow over the room. "I know it's simple," he said, suddenly seeming nervous, "but we can make changes, whatever would please you." Harriet silenced him with a gentle finger to his lips. "It's perfect, Mason. Everything about this day has been perfect." He caught her hand and pressed a kiss to her palm. "I never thought I'd have this," he admitted. "A wife, a family. After my mother and brother and I were separated, I closed off that part of myself, didn't think I deserved it." Harriet reached up to touch the wooden cross he still wore. "Is that from her, your mother?" Mason nodded. "The only thing I have left of her. She pressed it into my hand the last time I saw her. Said as long as I kept faith, we'd meet again someday." "And your brother?" Harriet asked gently. "Found him after the war. He's in California now with his wife. We write sometimes." Mason's arms encircled her waist. "But you and Clara, you're my family now. My present and my future." When he kissed her, it was different from the chaste kisses they had shared before, deeper, filled with a longing that had been building between them. Harriet responded with equal fervor, her arms winding around his neck as she gave herself to the moment and the man she had chosen. Later, as they lay together in the quiet darkness, Mason's arm a comforting weight across her waist, Harriet reflected on the journey that had brought her here. From the depths of despair on that auction platform to this moment of profound happiness, it seemed almost impossible. "What are you thinking?" Mason asked, his voice drowsy. Harriet turned to face him, tracing the line of his jaw with her fingertips. "That sometimes the worst moments of our lives can lead us to the best. If my parents hadn't died, if we hadn't lost everything, I never would have met you." Mason kissed her forehead tenderly. "I wish you hadn't had to suffer to find your way here, but I'm grateful every day that you did." "As am I," Harriet whispered, settling into the circle of his arms. "As am I." Spring came early to West Texas in 1876. The ranch flourished under the combined efforts of Mason, Harriet, and their loyal hands. With the profits from a successful cattle sale, Mason expanded the operation, adding more grazing land and improving the house with Harriet's guidance. Clara divided her time between the ranch and town, where her position at Mrs. Sullivan's dress shop had evolved into a partnership. The younger Vance sister had blossomed in her new life, developing confidence and skills that would have remained dormant in Virginia's rigid society. One mild March evening, as Harriet and Mason sat on their porch watching the sunset, she decided it was time to share her news. "I visited Dr. Reynolds in town today," she began, trying to keep her voice casual. Mason immediately looked concerned. "Are you ill? You've seemed tired lately." Harriet took his hand, placing it gently on her still flat stomach. "Not ill, just expecting. We're going to have a baby, Mason." His expression transformed from worry to wonder in an instant. "A baby," he repeated, as if unable to comprehend the word. "Yes, Dr. Reynolds thinks sometime in October." Mason pulled her into his arms, laughing with pure joy. "A baby," he said again, this time with certainty. "Our child." The months that followed were busy ones. Mason insisted on building a proper nursery adjacent to their bedroom and sent all the way to San Antonio for a rocking chair similar to one Harriet had described from her childhood home. Clara threw herself into creating tiny garments for her future niece or nephew, while Mrs. Sullivan organized the ladies of Fort Stockton to prepare a baby quilt as a gift for the town's most beloved new couple. By summer, Harriet's condition was obvious, her slender frame now gracefully rounded with new life. Mason became increasingly protective, trying to limit her activities despite her protests. "I'm pregnant, not made of glass," she reminded him after he objected to her helping in the garden. "Indulge me," he replied, kissing her forehead. "I just want you both safe." On a scorching August afternoon, disaster struck. A wildfire, started by lightning in the drought-parched grasslands, raced toward the ranch from the west. Mason and the hands rode out to create fire breaks, leaving Hank to protect the house and the women. Harriet, now 7 months pregnant, refused to sit idle. Despite Hank's protests, she organized the defense of their home, soaking blankets to beat out stray embers, filling buckets from the well, and moving livestock to the eastern pasture away from the approaching flames. The fire line reached within a quarter-mile of the ranch buildings before Mason and his men managed to divert its path. When he returned, smoke blackened and exhausted, he found Harriet still directing operations from the porch. "You should be resting," he admonished, though pride shone in his eyes. "Our home was in danger," she replied simply. "Besides, the baby and I are fine, better than you look, in fact." That night, after Mason had bathed away the soot and ash, he held Harriet close in their bed, his hand protectively cradling her rounded belly. "I was so afraid today," he confessed in the darkness. "Afraid of losing everything, you, the baby, our home." Harriet covered his hand with her own. "But you didn't. We fought together, as we always will." "I've never known anyone as strong as you, Harriet Fairchild," Mason said with quiet admiration. "Our child is lucky to have you for a mother." In October, as the first cool breezes of autumn brought relief from the summer heat, Harriet went into labor. Clara and Mrs. Sullivan attended her, along with the midwife from town. Mason paced the porch for hours, jumping at every sound from within the house. After a long but uncomplicated labor, Harriet gave birth to a healthy son with a shock of dark hair and his father's blue eyes. When Mason was finally allowed to enter, he approached the bed with reverence, tears streaming unashamedly down his face at the sight of Harriet cradling their child. "Mason, meet your son," Harriet said softly, lifting the tiny bundle toward him. With trembling hands, Mason took the infant, staring in wonder at the perfect little face. "He's magnificent," he whispered, "just like his mother." They named him Thomas Henry Fairchild Thomas after Harriet's father, and Henry after Mason's brother. Little Thomas thrived, growing strong on the clean Texas air and his mother's love. Mason proved to be a devoted father, often carrying the baby with him around the ranch, pointing out cattle and horses to the attentive infant as if the child could understand every word. Life settled into a new routine shaped by Thomas's needs, but Harriet and Mason made time for each other as well, their bond deepening with their shared parenthood. By Thomas's first birthday, Clara had news of her own. She had accepted a proposal from the young schoolteacher who had been courting her for months. Their wedding was set for the following spring, and Clara would move permanently to town, though she promised to visit the ranch often. "Are you happy for her?" Mason asked Harriet as they watched Clara excitedly showing her engagement ring to Mrs. Sullivan. "Completely," Harriet assured him. "She deserves all the happiness in the world." "As do you," Mason said, slipping his arm around her waist. "Are you happy, Harriet?" "With this life we've built." Harriet looked around at the gathering friends from town, ranch hands who had become family, Clara radiant with joy, and little Thomas sleeping peacefully in Hank's protective arms. Then she looked at Mason, the man who had saved her and Clara from unthinkable fates, who had offered protection when they were most vulnerable, who had opened his heart and his home to them. "More than happy," she answered truthfully. "I'm blessed beyond measure." On the porch that evening, after the guests had gone and Thomas was asleep in his crib, Harriet and Mason sat hand in hand, watching the stars emerge above their land. "I was thinking," Mason said, "about that day at the auction, how close we came to never meeting." Harriet squeezed his hand. "But we did meet. You said those words that changed everything. I'll take you both and keep you together." "Best decision I ever made," Mason murmured, drawing her close. "Though I had no idea then how completely you would change my life." "We changed each other's lives," Harriet corrected. "Found each other when we most needed someone to believe in." As they sat together in the gentle Texas night, surrounded by the home they had built, Harriet thought of all the twists of fate that had brought them to this moment: the tragic deaths of her parents, the cruel auction block, the kindness of a stranger who became her husband and the father of her child. From the darkest moment of her life had come this abundant happiness, this profound love. Mason's arms tightened around her as if he could read her thoughts. "I love you, Harriet Fairchild," he whispered against her hair. "And I love you," she replied, turning to meet his kiss, "now and always." Above them, the vast Texas sky spread out like a promise: endless possibilities, endless tomorrows, endless love under the same stars that had witnessed their beginning. From the auction block to this peaceful porch, their journey had been unexpected and sometimes difficult, but Harriet wouldn't have changed a single step that had led her here, to this man, this child, this life. Together, they had created something beautiful from the broken pieces of their pasts. Together, they would face whatever the future held, secure in the knowledge that they had found in each other not just love, but home.